Welcome to Raving Ryan. I'm your host, Ryan Anastasio. Today I have a very special guest. He's running for the Republican nomination for governor in 2018, Steve Obsitnik. Mr. Obsitnik, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
You grew up in Stanford and then attended Stanford High School. Then you went on to the United States Naval Academy, and you served in the Navy for several years. Can you tell me about your experience at the Naval Academy and then what it was like to then serve in the Navy?
Yeah. So I attended the Naval Academy. My dad, my uncle, and my brother all went before me. And when I was 17, I said, hey, maybe I should go to the Naval Academy. And they all said, no, Steve, we know you. You shouldn't go to the Naval Academy. So what does a 17-year-old boy do when your dad, brother, and uncle say? You go to the Naval Academy. So I was very fortunate that Stuart McKinney, who was a congressman down in Fairfield County, nominated me. And it was a challenging 4 years. Basically, the mission of the Naval Academy is to prepare midshipmen morally, mentally, and physically. So the whole curriculum and everything is to challenge you on those three things. You make sure morally you're able to kind of serve people because you're put in charge of people's lives. Mentally, as far as academically, you can kind of do the job as an officer, and physically, you can stand up to the pressure that's going to come. So it was a great experience to kind of be challenged on all three of those fronts.
And in the Navy, I understand you were on a submarine as a nuclear engineer, and I understand you were under the polar ice cap for over 6 months. What was that experience like to be in a submarine in that enclosed space for so long?
Well, you just kind of get used to it, I guess. I think it's like closing the windows here and us hanging out in this room for 6 months. We probably get tired of each other once in a while. But for me, it's just something that I was maybe meant to do. I didn't really have a problem with it, especially when you're focused on kind of the mission. And I think in my case, we went up to the North Pole and spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean and then in the kind of central mid-Atlantic doing a lot of drug operations. So it's just what the Pentagon does and tells you to do. You go accomplish the mission.
And you're an entrepreneur and have been the CEO of several successful technology companies. I understand you've worked on many projects such as Siri on the iPhone, and you've worked across the country building businesses. Right. Can you tell us about your entrepreneurial career and some of the projects you have worked on, such as Siri?
Yeah. So I think with my entrepreneurial background, I think there are two types of entrepreneurs. There are creators and there are synthesizers. And creators are like Steve Jobs or Hewlett & Packard. They come out of the garage and say, Ryan, buy this, right? Yeah. They kind of just know what you need. And that's not me. I'm more of a synthesizer. I have to kind of sit with people and say, oh, you're working on some cool technology over here. Maybe there's a buyer over here that solves this problem. And I kind of synthesize needs. So that's just how I've always approached building businesses, being a synthesizer. So I was fortunate when I went to Silicon Valley, I worked in a place called the Stanford Research Institute, which was part of Stanford University. So there were a lot of smart people with cool technology, and I studied customer problems. So the first thing we did was a company called Diva, where we wanted to basically deliver movies to home because we had Blockbuster, but we tried to deliver it through the cable networks. So that was really challenging because no one before, we were the first ones to create ESPN on demand, Showtime on demand, Disney on demand. No one ever thought about that. So we had to get all the licensing rights and have the technology to deliver it and then convince customers to take it. And it took a long time to change adoption. So but it's those type of problems that I've enjoyed getting into, big ideas in either new markets or existing markets, being disruptive and making people's lives, better for it.
And what did you do to work on Siri? What was your role in that?
Yeah, so Siri was an overnight success that took 13 years. And Siri was part of a larger DARPA project, which is basically the advanced development arm of the military. And Siri was an important part of how the government wanted soldiers to be able to communicate why they had their fingers on a trigger or on switches. So they had SRI and a number of other organizations develop this. And you're probably not aware that there were 2 Yale professors who actually were involved with the early days of what Siri was. So can you imagine if Siri had been in New Haven instead of Menlo Park, California, what we'd be talking about? So Siri had a lot of hands involved, but I was involved in the early commercialization of it in terms of going to customers and saying, what do you think? Do you want to buy this? And about 90 doors were slammed in our face. People don't want to talk to computers on their phones effectively or on their devices, and it was just before smartphones were taking a broad adoption. So the people at SRI basically said, all the doors are being slammed on us. We think the future is going to go in this direction. And I worked on other speech projects like the company before I started called Discern Communications. So I was familiar with the problem set and where the technology was evolving. And then it was just decided that it was time to spin SRI or Siri out of SRI. And the CEO of SRI said, Steve, okay, it's time. You're going to come back to California, because I was in Connecticut, to run this. I said, no, I'm going to stay in Connecticut. You know, you guys are really cool, and the CEO should be there. But there's something that just wanted to keep me here instead of going back to California.
And you are not a career politician, and you spent your life building businesses. How is your experience going to help you to be the next governor of Connecticut?
Yeah, so I ran for Congress 4 years ago, and that from there I kind of figured out what's similar in business, and there was a lot of similarities. How you market yourself, how do you try to sell and package, you know, a candidate, and so a lot of things were transferable from there. But I think that what's different in this election is we see what's going on around the country. We see Massachusetts has turned themselves around. Florida is thriving. You look, Maryland has gone from about 42nd in business friendliness to 13 in 3 years. You see what Mitch Daniels did in Indiana. Like, what's the common theme? That many states and people in states have said it's just time for a pragmatic business outsider who knows how the world is working, who can work with people, can come in and solve problems that politicians haven't solved for generations. So, you know, if people trust a politician to solve the problems Connecticut has, go hire another politician. Or the other path is someone who grew up here as a kid, understands our culture, our values, has served in the military here, has created high-tech jobs that I want for you and your brother and others, and know how people are competing. So people have to pick a path of the politician or the path of the business outsider. And I'm fortunate that I can make that argument, I think.
Someone that's a career politician would say that they have contacts and they could be able to work with the legislature. How are you going to be able to work with the legislature? And you haven't been in the legislature. You haven't been like a mayor or anything. So how are you going to be able to work with the state legislature? Because it's not a one-man job as governor.
Yeah, I think I fall back on my experience, right? When you find yourself 400 feet under the polar ice cap on a Sunday morning with 500 men who you have to wake up, who are away from their families, and get them excited to get in the bilge of a submarine and get motivated to clean it. You don't just say, get in the bilge of the submarine and I'll be back in 2 hours. You get in there with them and you talk to them why it's important. You come to a common vision of what do we need to accomplish in this state, and why what we've been doing is, a lot of it's been right, but we have to change culturally what we've been doing if we want to grow again. So a lot of it's just how I interact with people and how I've led with people, with them, alongside them, in the trenches, in the bilges, and a lot of it's just how you interact with people. So I'm not a top-down, my way or the highway. I like to build consensus around big vision, and that's what things like Siri did and Discern. It was like, let's not focus on the short-term, immediate problems. Let's focus on something big that can actually change the game, right, for Connecticut in this case. And what I believe, it comes down to one simple thing, that over the last 8 years, 30,000 jobs have been destroyed here, okay? I have a plan for building 300,000 jobs over the next 8 years, a 5-step plan. So I think legislatures will come together around, yes, we want to build 300,000 jobs here. And that only grows our economy at about 1.6% GDP growth. That's half of what the overall United States is growing at. So let's focus on a big vision like that. And then how do you accomplish that? You do things like make it more affordable here. You do things about making government more streamlined, getting people into business faster. Building or planting seeds like I saw in the Silicon Valley around like Roosevelt Island initiatives around industry-led ecosystems, which we can talk about. But it's about big things that you structurally can change and align that to a big goal, and people will align to that goal, I feel.
The state is currently in the midst of a financial crisis. There's currently a deficit of around $200 million. It's likely, if you're governor, that it could be more. What are you going to do specifically on the deficit to cut that down and make sure we can get the state in a surplus?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's basically the $4 billion question, because that's what our two biennium deficit is going to look like. So the first thing we need to do is be honest with ourselves and the workers of Connecticut that the pension plans that they were promised have been underfunded. So we need to deliver a sustainable pension plan for people that they can count on, but also the taxpayers of Connecticut can afford.
Would you consider eliminating the state pension over time?
I don't know if there's an elimination. I think people who work...
Like cut people off over time, would you?
No, that's not my... I think that people working in any environment, a pension, a 401k plan, is an important part of a retirement safety net for people. So I don't see about cutting or getting rid of a pension. I think you have to make it more secure. So if you're a current pensioner, I will live up to the obligations that the state provided on your normal pension payments, right? If you're a new employee, it's time for a 401k plan. It works for everyone else. And for the current workers, it's important to get to a plan that they can count on that's secure and sustainable. And right now, they're paying into a plan which is probably going to be bankrupt in 5 years. So I take the responsibility of making the plan solvent, not just for taxpayers, but for the hardworking people that work for the state, because they want to count on a pension that's there. And right now, I don't think they can.
Tim Herbst, a fellow Republican that's running for governor, said that he would eliminate the Department of Motor Vehicles. If elected as governor, are there any departments you would consider cutting spending, or just eliminating the department entirely?
Yeah, I think we have to rethink or reinvent how we deliver services in a lot of ways. And so one of the businesses I started, Discern Communications, we did a lot in the voice over IP call center world. And we work with a lot of federal and state governments about how do you bring more efficiencies to them in terms of using technology to deliver a better service to a citizen at a better price point. We've worked with Department of Motor Vehicles, Department of Taxations. So I think it's a little bombastic to say you're going to get rid of a DMV system, because I don't think you will. I think you can rethink how you use technology to have people do more things on home, printing out their computers, or how do you leverage maybe town halls, local town halls, as franchisors of the DMV, so that maybe the state DMV gets smaller and more efficient, but we get services closer to where you live, so you don't have to drive 30 minutes and wait in a 4-hour line.
There are many businesses have left the state. General Electric left a few years. Alexion is leaving. Aetna was planning on leaving, but when CVS bought them, they decided not to. What are you going to do to try to keep businesses in the state and try to have a pro-business friendly environment and be able to work with the businesses?
Yeah. So first thing is tone. My first night I went to sea, the captain of my submarine woke me up and took me back to the engineering space and taught me how to do a 2-hour zone inspection. We'll talk about zone inspections when I come back. But when I was back there with him, he said, Steve, I'm going to give you the one leadership lesson you need to know in life. Leaders set tone. Tone creates a culture, and culture is your destiny. Leaders set tone creates a culture is your destiny. I had no idea what he meant at the time, but I wrote it down on my pad, and every so often I went back to that. And I've just come to learn that what leaders do is set tone. And when we have a leader right now in Hartford who basically says, you know what, chief apologizer, can't do anything about the cost of living here, can't do anything about GE leaving and so forth. What does that do? That creates a culture of people who don't want to live in that. And then the destiny is GE and others leave. So I think we need a governor who needs to be the chief economic development officer of the state of Connecticut, who will stand up to Governor Charlie Baker across the border, jab him in the chest nicely and say, hands off our seniors, hands off our businesses, and I'm going to change policies here so that they want to stay here. So those policies are things like, it's too hard to form a business here. There's too many rules and regulations. You have to go to too many different people to do it. Why don't we create a SEAL team of business advisors who you go to one person and they help you get into business? Right? You don't have to go to 20 people. You go to one person and let them deal with inside the state. Second of all, the First Five program, which Dan Malloy has, which is giving away hundreds of millions of dollars to businesses, doesn't work. I think you simplify it. You look at something like this. If you hire someone in the state of Connecticut, you can earn up to a $10,000 tax credit for that person you hire and for the next 10 years as long as that person works for you. I don't care if you're ESPN, some fancy hedge fund, or your pizza restaurant down the street. It really shouldn't make a difference. If people are committed to Connecticut and hire another person, they should get a benefit. And the third thing is, what I talked about before, is how do we create these industry-led ecosystems? How do we get our 42 colleges in Connecticut to work with our 17 Fortune 500 companies that are here and all the smaller companies to create a trained supply chain of people who actually will get educated here and will actually go to work for those businesses here, grow families here, and hopefully retire here?
Yeah, but is it possible? You said that GE moved to Boston, and you talked about giving tax incentives. But is it possible to compete with a place like Boston? I mean, there's so many things in Boston. Lots of people. You got Harvard and all these all these other technology companies there. How can we be Boston? I mean, how can we make sure businesses don't move to Boston?
Well, it wasn't too long ago that Massachusetts wanted to be Connecticut. And now look, we've looked up after 20 years, and now Massachusetts is what Connecticut used to be, right? So that's what leaders do. Leaders set tone. Tone creates a culture, right? And it won't happen overnight. But we have to realize our assets. We have 42 colleges, okay? And we have proximity. Location has not moved out of Connecticut yet. We have 1/3 of the U.S. economy is within 500 miles of us. We have a lot of things here. We have 95, 91, 84. We have access to major airports and seaports. They've just been mismanaged for far too long. And we need to stop doing things the old way and reinvent how we do things to deliver better services to citizens and businesses, do a better job of managing our money, and manage the money that we spend on debt service and the pension costs so that we free up money to invest back into the people. It's kind of as simple as that.
And Governor Malloy gave a tax incentive to ESPN a few years ago for creating hundreds of jobs, and ESPN over the last couple of years has been cutting these jobs. So what are you going to do as governor to make sure when you give tax incentives, you make sure that the jobs stay there for a prolonged amount of time?
And so he gave away a lot of money without a lot of handcuffs on it. So what I said a few minutes ago, it addresses the problem. If ESPN were to hire one person today, they could earn up to a $10,000 tax credit for that person. But the person gets fired next year, they don't get it. It goes away. Up to $10,000 per person for the next 10 years, right? But along the way, if they drop off, they don't get it. So you pay them after the fact. What you do is you don't pay someone up front to do it. You pay somebody, or you give them an incentive after the fact. And you also make it blind to political relationships. So if you're a Subway owner, or you're a car dealership, or you're ESPN, you have the same pool to pull out of. You don't make political connectedness and the measure by which you decide who gets money.
And the city of Hartford is also in a financial crisis, and we heard the news that Governor Malloy has announced that he's going to help give money to Hartford to help get them out of their deficit because they're about to declare bankruptcy. Are you in favor of giving money to Hartford to help them? Because, I mean, they are a capital city.
Dan Malloy's management of our finances has been disastrous. So anything that he's doing so far has taken us down a road to ruin. It didn't work when you gave hundreds of millions of dollars away to businesses, so how's it going to work with cities? I don't think that's the right approach.
Do you have a plan for Hartford, though?
I don't have a plan right now I'm willing to throw out. I'm talking to a lot of people about it, but I don't think it starts by just throwing more money at the problem. I think in the end it comes down to creating an ecosystem around Hartford that draws on the assets that are there, and maybe we need to motivate an applied research university to move to Hartford. Stanford University lost out to Cornell in that Roosevelt Island project in New York, so maybe Stanford University wants to go to Hartford, Connecticut. Let's ask, right? So sometimes politicians think they always have to have the answers. Sometimes you just have to ask what the market wants and then deliver that, and that's what I've done all my business life. And politicians don't do that. They just tend to try to think about one election to the next and then hold on in between and make sure they don't make enough mistakes before they get there.
Some politicians have brought up the idea of bringing tolls back to the state of Connecticut. They say this should bring millions of dollars of revenue and would help us get out of our deficit. Are you in favor of tolls in the state?
I'm not in favor of tolls if that money goes in the general fund. Because whenever we send more money to Hartford, it just goes to pay for more general fund obligations like pensions and health care and things like that. So we cannot afford to put another tax on the citizens of Connecticut if it isn't going to improve infrastructure. That being said, if there's a mechanism to make sure that as you raise user fees, that goes back to fix roads and bridges, I'm an evidence-based person. I've looked at the numbers. Massachusetts brings in about $300 million a year in tolls. About a third of that comes from out-of-state people. 2/3 come from in-state, okay? But I think we have to have a discussion about where the revenue sources come from to fund our infrastructure. They're either going to come from sales taxes, income taxes, tolls, or making government more efficient to free up money to pay for the infrastructure improvements. So I think we start there first. We say, how do we make government more efficient? Because right now I think we're spending way too much on way too many things, and let's define fewer priorities and deliver on them.
So you're not ruling tolls out right now?
I'm not ruling them. I'm an evidence-based person. As an engineer and an entrepreneur, I've always said you have to look at the facts, but I will rule it out on this. If if the money does not go into a secure lockbox that a politician can put their hands in and move it to another pocket, I'm not for it. That's the first requirement. And if that requirement's not there, I'm not for tolls.
If we were to put tolls in, the state would not be allowed to just put it on the borders, because when we eliminated tolls in 1983, made an agreement with the federal government. Would it? If you added tolls, you'd have to put them all across the state, and there'd be a toll every exit. So wouldn't that be?
Not necessarily every exit. I've heard different plans.
Because people would be able to get off and go around.
And okay, if they do, I think there are experts, more trained than I. Yeah. So I would have to talk to the experts about it. I think putting them at every toll, at every exit, doesn't necessarily make sense. But there's also, what's the price? Because everyone fears that every time you get off an exit, it's going to be $5. Yeah. I don't know if that's the case. Maybe it's a penny. Maybe it's a nickel. So, I think we have to get into understanding the situation and what the solutions are, and then rule on the merits. But once again, if the money goes into a piggy bank that politicians can put their hands on to fund some other pet project other than what it's meant for, I'm not for it.
I want to finish up with some personal questions. Do you have any hobbies?
I do. I guess this has become my hobby and my passion. Running for office here, I do try to work out, run, yoga, things like that for my spare time. Spending time with my daughters is, I guess, a hobby too.
Okay, I'm really going to put you in the hot seat right now. Connecticut is really well known for its pizza places. Do you have a favorite place in the state?
Yes. Stanford, Mario the Baker. Yep. I've been going there ever since I was in 6th grade. So, Tommy, you should check it out down there. Check out Tommy down at Stanford and Mario the Baker.
Pepe's or Sally's?
Probably more. It depends on the mood, but I probably would go Sally more often than Sally's than I would do Pepe.
Yes, I agree. All right, Steve Obsitnik, thank you very much for coming on. It was great having you.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, go to ravingryan.com. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and follow him on Facebook and Twitter. And what's your campaign website?
It's steveobsitnik.com. STEVEOBSITNIK.com.
Thank you for watching. Reporting for Raving Ryan, I'm Ryan Anastasio.